Richard Wolff from Democracy at Work with another Wolff response. The events in Washington, D.C. of January 6, 2021 have shocked many around the world, but they probably should not have. They were not a surprise. They did not come out of nowhere. They should not have been such a surprise at all. Why? They are part of a process unfolding in the United States that perhaps many folks did not want to see, but that have been in plain view anyway. Let me explain. At least since the 1970s, the American working classes, the people who are employees for a living, working in offices, stores, and factories, the vast majority of our people have been under heavy pressure from an economic system that was no longer friendly to them, as it had been in the aftermath of the Great Depression and World War II. In the 1970s, there began to be a growing split between the benefits of our capitalist system for the top 5% of our people and the costs of that system, which were being loaded onto the other 95%. Wages stagnated. People were unable to capture that middle-class American dream that had been held out as somehow an entitlement of the American working class. It slipped further and further away as people could not keep up with wages that didn't rise anymore, even when the women went out to work, even when the children did something on the weekend, even when the older people became greeters at Walmart. So difficult was it that a whole new level of debt had to be taken up by the American working class. Debt to buy your car, debt to buy your home, debt with your credit card to buy even a minor item at a local store, and finally the credit now necessary to go to college. To the underpayment at work, to the overworkedness at the job, you now added the anxieties of debt. It was harder and harder to hold your family together. It was harder and harder to hold any of your relationships together. Families dissolved. Marriages dissolved. The American working class was exhausted, and it turned inward. And for the last 30 years, it was like a sleeping giant. But it has now woken up. Why? Because while it was sleeping, the conditions that put it to sleep only got worse. Inequality widened in the United States. The difficulties, the precariousness of work got worse. The gap between the political leaders and the mass of people widened. I could go on, but you all know the story. And finally, if you keep prodding a sleeping giant, he wakes up. She wakes up. And that's what happened. The last 10 years have been an angry, irritated, working class giant rearing his and her head up. It started in 2011 with the Occupy Wall Street movement. Suddenly, overnight it seemed, in 300 cities, people set up tents in the downtown to protest the gap between the 1% and everybody else. A gap which got worse over the last 10 years because nobody responded at the level of leadership to what the Occupy movement made so clear. Then in 2016, we began to see what an angry, exhausted, waking giant could do. In England, very similar to here, that angry giant decided that the problem wasn't the capitalist system they lived in. the wages they weren't being paid, the overwork being demanded of them, the disintegrating society. No, they decided the problem was Europe. And so they voted for Brexit. They voted to get rid of Europe, to leave Europe. That made no sense at all. In the last 5 years of Brexit, England has continued to become more unequal, more economically depressed, a disaster. And also in 2016, the United States angry working people, the waking giant, voted for Trump. He sounded different. He looked different. He made grandiose promises. He didn't seem like the conventional half-asleep politicians who had run the society into the ground. But he turned out to be like the English. He promised everything and told us that our problems were poor immigrants from Latin America and the Chinese. That's as crazy as the British thinking their problem was Europe. So we beat up on the immigrants and we attacked the Chinese with tariffs and trade wars. Did it improve the economic conditions of the last 4 years? Not a bit. They deteriorated. And then we saw with horror how bad it was when this rich country did worse in fighting the pandemic than almost any other country on earth, including many with far fewer resources. This is an economic system spinning out of control. And what was seen in the Capitol building of Washington on January 6th was just another manifestation of angry working class people. But you know, when you're angry and you've woken up after being asleep and not paying too much attention to the problems accumulating around you, you're an easy mark for right-wing politicians who can say what you want to hear and get you to support them. And those folks can also be won over to the wildest theories. That's why some of those at the Capitol wanted to elect the president who just lost an election, while others who were there believed that an international ring of pedophiles is the cause of the pandemic. Are people a little bit crazy? Yes, they've been under too much pressure. Decades of being overworked and underpaid and over-indebted and underappreciated take their toll. And by the way, they will continue to do so unless basic changes happen in this country. Changes far beyond anything that the establishment of the Democratic Party, and especially Joe Biden, have ever endorsed, discussed, or initiated. We need to do something about the inequality of this society. Even during the pandemic, we allowed the richest amongst us to become much richer while 25 million people sit gathering unemployment compensation as I speak. The economic system is a bust except for the few at the top. That has to be changed. And the only way to do that is to change it at the base, inside every enterprise, every factory, every store, every office. We have to bring democracy. We have to bring a situation where all the people who work together, one person, one vote, decide what to produce, what technology to use, where to carry out the production, and what to do with the profits that the enterprise generates. No more allowing a tiny handful of people at the top, the owner, the board of directors, the major shareholders. Allowing them to make those decisions is what enriches them and impoverishes you and me. Mr. Bezos doesn't know what to do with his $200 billion, but most of the Amazon employees that make him rich can't afford to send their kids to college. That's the problem. And if you don't deal with that, then you're going to see more of what we saw on January 6th, not less. That's why we saw what we saw on January 6th, despite the Occupy movement 10 years earlier and all of the intervening events. The sleeping giant has awoken, and now we have to deal with what that means. This is Richard Wolff from Democracy at Work.